Okay, let's see if we can squeeze in a couple of chapters here. I'll go over the plot points initially, and then I will continue on again with my notes. Chapter 14, they lead Chihuahua through an extended raid. Again, the landscape, weather becomes a character in some ways. It's this sort of apocalyptic rain. Usually anything that has to do with the weather is apocalyptic. It seems like, as much as the rain, it's like pouring rain. There's an extended explanation of sort of how the rain is so rainy. That's the best way I can talk about it. They encounter the town of Jesus Maria, which is a mining town. Once there, they're entertained and sort of welcomed. They're still, the people there are still pretty wary for good reason, but they're kind of like, okay, it's kind of an outposty type place. Doesn't look like you need anything out of us. We don't need anything out of you, so we'll just kind of let you guys hang out. There's a priest. There's a scene where a priest comes out. He's mocked, has coins thrown at him. He comes out and sort of, does this priestly thing where he's like, "Oh, why are you doing this to the town or whatever?" Sort of he plays his role, and then the Glanton gang mocks him by throwing coins at him, sort of hitting him like, "Hey, here, you want gold? Here's gold," but he's actually picking them up while he's kind of cursing under his voice. He's like, pick them up, So he's not above, taking their money, essentially. There's the Feast of Animas that begins, which gives you a little clue about when this is happening, right around October or so, in Mexico. So, and once all of this is going on, Glanton goes crazy and begins firing into the crowd. So, I'll make note of what that may mean, in understanding sort of the sanity of these characters, or the non-sanity, I guess, of these characters. But all that happens here is that Glanton seems to go a little overboard even for the game, okay? So, plot continues. Judge overpays for some dogs. There's these kids that come up to him and say, "Hey, you want to buy these dogs?" And the judge does pay for them, and then there's not a very pleasant scene where he drowns them. Just to sort of express his power. There's not really a good explanation of why he does it. He just kind of does it because it's like not the expected thing. So more on that maybe a little bit later, but it kind of tells you a lot about who the judge is. So if you were ever like starting to get drawn into the charisma of the judge, this is one of those moments where maybe you kind of just pull back and go, Glanton, after he goes crazy, like I said before, he's tied up and he desecrates a flag. He kills an old woman, and then they have to flee, and some are killed. Okay, so even for the gang, how they're normally they don't have they overstay their welcome. Here they kind of fast forward it. Okay, things are going a little bit more in fast forward. They're spending less and less time in the city, and they're revealing their characters more and more. The earlier, so the chaos is happening almost right away when they come in. When they flee up the mountainside, they toss mules over a ledge. The only reason I highlight this is because this is kind of a poetic thing, and I just wanted to highlight for a moment in this the language. Okay, one of the things that may be overlooked if you're not sort of reading along, or at least you're just sort of relying on these maybe a little bit more and you're reading a little fast, is that the language itself in this book is very poetic, right? There's something beautiful about this language sometimes, even though he's describing these ridiculous, chaotic, violent moments, and that's pretty much Cormac McCarthy stock and trade. But I just thought I'd highlight that, turning sedately in the empty air and exploding on the rocks below in startling bursts of lead and silver. I mean, ignoring what's actually happening, that the sound of that, right? It kind of just flows off the tongue. So I don't know what you can do with that at this point for now, but that's just something maybe to note. Maybe the language itself is something that you might want to think about later on. They eventually get to the town of Ures, the capital of Sonora, and it's filled with lowlives, people just like the Glanton gang. Okay, so lots of whoring, lots of violence, lots of chaos. Okay. But even among this group, the Glanton gang stands out, okay? So they take over a hotel, and they bring horses into the hotel. They set up a spit, which is like a big fire pit, in the middle of the lobby, and they have 20, 30 whores. There are fires in the streets, general chaos. So even in the midst of these low lives, and, I don't know if there's a better way of putting that, but that's not a very charitable way of saying it, But even among these people that are the dregs, the Gluttony Gang comes in and kind of takes over and says, "Oh, you think you're dregs before? Wait until you see us." Moving on a little bit to chapter 15. They get the contract from Sonora. Once they're in Sonora, they do get another contract for scalps. And once they leave, they get into a running fight with soldiers. They make a decision on the wounded that they have. So remember, they've started to take some casualties here. So as they're being chased, they do get by soldiers. And remember, every time they encounter soldiers, that's bad news because that's sort of the federal government. So without getting into a big lengthy discussion on what that means in terms of the strata of authority, essentially you have a federal government that's in charge of the soldiers, which are sort of the policing unit of the federal government. But then there's individual governors and stuff that are sort of in charge of that area. So every time they encounter soldiers, it's like, uh-oh, these guys probably know who we are. But when they go to these individual authorities within this broad, unsettled landscape, they can sort of get away with a lot more. Okay. So that's why whenever they encounter soldiers, there's a real clash that goes on because they might be in communication saying, hey, this is another one of those gangs that are sort of attacking people at will. So the Delawares, when the Delawares are faced with they're wounded, they kill them, okay, without any remorse. They're just like, hey, this is the way it is. If you recall back earlier in one of the other lectures, we talked about how the world as it is versus the world that you want it to be kind of thing. I'm not going to go directly into the quote, but essentially the Delawares see the world a little differently, right? It's like, well, of course, they're wounded and we're going to kill them, and even the people that are being killed are like, yeah, I can't go anywhere, so, of course you're going to kill me. Kind of this fatalistic, that's how the world works. But every now and again, the kid, I don't know if you'd call it a conscience, but he does have the closest thing to a conscience here. And he, instead of killing Shelby, this is the moment where he hides Shelby, okay? Even though he knows, and everybody kind of knows that by doing that, he's kind of sentencing him to be tortured to death. But he can't bring himself to kill this guy, even though he's wounded, and he knows that he's going to fall into the hands because Shelby says, just give me a gun and I'll figure it out, right? Because he's kind of desperate. He doesn't want to die, obviously. He also probably doesn't want to be tortured to death, so in this case, maybe the mercy would be more, I don't know. I mean, that's kind of up to you to decide. So Tate returns. This is another guy in the gang that I haven't mentioned in the lecture, but he's just one of those characters, one of the people in the gang. He makes an appearance, and then it begins to snow. And again, we don't just have snow in McCarthy's landscape. We have apocalyptic kind of snow, right? So they're set upon by scouts, and we follow the kid as he wanders into a snowy landscape. So he wanders around by himself. And there's something about that I probably want to make note of too later on. So he finds a burning tree. He, being the kid, warms himself, follows some hoof prints. I have cues there, but that may be in reference to some discussion questions, but depending on how you encounter this, you may not see those. And other animals join in. It's an interesting moment. Excuse me, get a little dry. It's an interesting moment because he starts a fire. The animals start coming in, but they go kind of stay in the dark. And so as he's gathered around this, huddled around this fire, the snow is so bad that the animals themselves are kind of freezing too. So they just kind of huddle with the warmth. And so as the kid looks up and he sees in the dark, all he sees are like these glowing eyes, right? Like, they don't have the energy really to attack him and kill him, and they don't have much of an interest. They just kind of want to warm themselves by the fire. It's kind of a creepy, slow moment where it's like, oh, I'm not out here by myself. So, as in the light of the day, the next day, he sees the remains of another fire. And he realizes that he's sort of following the trail of, well, maybe not realizes, maybe he intended to do this, but he sort of encounters the trail of the other glamping gang, and he realizes that they've started burning the scalps, the money, essentially. They turn in these scalps for money, and so they become so desperate that they've started burning them themselves for warmth. So that's sort of the desperation at this point. He finds the glutton again, whatever's left of the glutton gang, and maybe the glutton himself. And they kill and eat a horse and find bodies and heads near the wrecked wagon. Okay. They ride into Santa Cruz, Presidio, which is like a military base. It's kind of a, I don't know, kind of a run-down military base. It's not by any means stretch of the imagination a ready-made, ready to attack you kind of base. And they encounter what is referred to as a Falstaffian militia. Falstaff being a character in a Shakespeare play, who's kind of a bumbling guy. So it's basically just saying this militia is very bumbling, not very competent. And then they settle down in the stable. Okay. So some of the notes that I have here, there's an extended scene in the rain. Remember the elemental force of the landscape. We witness nature in many cases in battle sort of with itself and in battle with the people. So think of the landscape as sort of this violent enemy that's also encountered. So blackened bones of trees assassinated in the mountain storms. So that's like a direct quote. Nature itself seems to be in a constant state of violence. So even like absent the people, the trees are being assassinated by storms. And, so even the language sort of invites this chaos and battling going on in nature. In Jesus Maria, which is the mining town, there's some Moorish folk tunes. The judge dances to them, and he has a strange precision to it, meaning he knows that this folk dance, right? In the middle of nowhere, there's these folk players, and they play this song, and there's a dance that goes with it, and the judge knows the dance. So strange, right? So there's a knowledge base there. This is sort of a display of his charisma and knowledge, and I make a reference here to Paradise Lost and Satan because Satan is a very charismatic guy, and he's really good with everything, including words. So that's something to make note of, is that he seems to have sort of a supernatural presence. There's some displays of corruption of the church and the narrative of salvation. There's a horse-drawn cart for a rude Christ. This man was drugged on the street and prodded obscenely. The priest baptizes the wounded American and then stood back while they were shot through the head. So there's 3 references to religion being this decaying sort of husk, essentially. So as a competing narrative, it's not real compelling. Okay, and remember narrative as we used it before, meaning that it's a means of creating a story for someone so that they follow the script and it retains some power. Okay. Some continuation of the notes. The Kid in the Snow. This seems to be kind of it starts to turn into a little bit of a survival tale in chapter 15. It's de-romanticizing the nature and survival in nature and man's dominion. What I mean by that is that presumably man is in control of nature, or at least he's supposed to be, by building these cities and these roads. But in this harsh landscape, he's just sort of another thing that's trying to survive. Okay, that's what I mean by that. De-romanticize it. There's no, oh my God, look at that landscape. It's so beautiful and peaceful. No, nothing's peaceful here. Okay. There's biblical references to the burning bush, and the burning bush is in the Bible, the voice of God talked through a burning bush to Moses. Don't call me on that, but it's a biblical reference, and this is not accidental. There's a lot of biblical references in here. I'm not going to point them all out because I'm not expecting you guys to be literary analysts, but that is something to make note of. And even after all this violence, another example of the judge taking stock of the landscape and animals. And here is a brief scene where they talk about the world, and Toadvine says, "What was the purpose in all of this?" And then the judge asks, "Whatever exists," he said, "whatever in creation exists without my knowledge exists without my consent. Only nature can enslave man." So in other words, the judge is basically saying, I am the creator of my own fate. Okay, nature. Once I name it and understand it, it has no other purpose for existing. So nature, as this larger purpose, only serves to confuse you. I myself am the judge. So once I am understanding it, I have no use for it otherwise. So unless it's serving me, it doesn't serve a purpose. Okay. So I hope this helps with chapter 15 and 14. So I will continue later on.